Hello, this is a video about how to do a feather stitch in hand embroidery. So I already have my fabric mounted and I already have my single thread knotted at one end. I'm going to come up through the bottom of my fabric and do until my knot reaches the edge of that fabric, and then I'm going to do one straight stitch, one stitch length away. Now I have my beginning stitch, so now my job is to come and I'm going to do a chain stitch angled out, coming up and away, and for a chain stitch I'm going underneath that straight stitch I just did, pulling it to the tension I want. So a chain, you don't want it too loose, but you don't want it too tight either. Coming back down that exact same hole that I just came up through, pulling that tension, taking care not to get any knots in my fabric. And you see how this chain stitch is slightly loose? That's where we want it to be for a good chain stitch. Right now the back of my fabric looks like this. Coming back in, I'm going to come up under the same stitch that I came down in for that straight stitch I did. Coming up through that same one, making sure my needle's going under the chain stitch, not through it. Pulling it taut. Now for a feather stitch, traditional feather stitches have angles, so I'm going to angle a straight stitch out. And then I'm going to do a chain stitch directly in line with that straight stitch. So I come up, hook around that straight stitch, making sure to see how my needle is underneath that straight stitch, pulling through to the tension I want, and back down again. Now I come back down that same hole I came down through for that straight stitch. I'm coming back up, making sure my needle goes under the chain stitch, come up, pull my tension tight, and then I angle the opposite direction of that straight stitch, come up, chain stitch, back down through that same hole like a good chain stitch, tension to where I want it, up in that same hole of the straight stitch under the chain stitch, angle, tension tight for the straight stitch, tension slightly looser for your chain stitch. Now you're making sure that your chain stitch, traditionally, when you're doing the feather stitch, that chain stitch is running along that same line as that straight stitch so that it forms a solid line. So the only time you should have a difference in the angle is when you're doing the straight stitch itself, not the chain stitch. So I'm coming up and I'm pretending my chain and my straight stitch are running along that exact same line with each other. And that is the basics of a feather stitch. I hope that helps.